hosted event by the State of Oregon Research Academy, otherwise known as SORA. If you've attended one of these before, you know that we very much welcome any comments, questions, or conversation that you may have with the speakers, and they'll go ahead and let you know sort of what their preference is, if they're okay with you just raising your hand during the presentation or waiting for a Q&A session afterwards. If you've not attended a SOAR event before, I do hope that this is an enjoyable experience and that we see you in future events. So today we have lined up two presentations. The first is by Assistant Professor Michael Kuhn from the University of Oregon, who's going to be talking about behavioral economics in the workplace. The second presentation is by our fellow Oregon Housing and Community Services research analyst Megan Bolton about the statewide housing plan and needs assessment. Before I introduce the first presenter, there are a couple housekeeping items that I want to cover. Exit is that way. If you walk out that door, I believe straight ahead, take your first right. There's where the restrooms are, as well as the elevators. And I think that hopefully covers it. Just lastly, I would like to extend my gratitude to the SOAR Executive Committee members. Without their support setting up this event, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you. Okay, so without further ado, our first speaker is Michael Kuhn. He joined the Department of Economics at the University of Oregon in 2014 after receiving his PhD from the University of California, San Diego. He is an applied behavioral economist with an interest in applications to consumer finance, public economics, and labor economics. He uses a variety of methods, laboratory experiments, field experiments, and observational data analysis to study the importance of behavioral theory for economic policy, the determinants of consumer preferences, and preference elicitation methodology. His research has been published in the Journal of Public Economics, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, and the Journal of Public Economic Theory. So without further ado, if we could welcome our first presenter, Michael.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. It's an absolute privilege to be here. Let's get this started. It's a privilege to be here. I didn't know how long I was planning for. I'm going to aim for about 40 minutes, and so you might see me skip over things, or if I run out of time at the end, I'll have to cut it short. But throughout, please just feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to take questions as we go. No need to wait for the end. So I'm going to talk to you about behavioral economics in the workplace specifically. And I chose to focus on the workplace just because it's a way of taking this really broad field of new economic theoretical research and narrowing down my focus and giving myself an organizing principle. The ideas that behavioral economists like myself, the theoretical ideas that we're working with, have been applied fruitfully to all sorts of areas of research and economic policy. But I thought the workplace was a nice organizing principle for today. Just to give you a general overview of where I'm going, I'm going to start with an overview of what is behavioral economics, and I'm going to try and illustrate what that is by laying out what I call the four-part foundation of how economists think of individual behavior. You know, you've probably heard of behavioral economics already. It seems like kind of a fad. I'm going to try and put a little bit more structure on what we're actually doing and how what we're doing is different, but also how what we're doing is really not that different in terms of researching and trying to improve economic policy from other economists that have been trying to do that for years. Then in the sort of the meat of the talk, I want to talk about how have the ideas of behavioral economic theory been applied to the workplace. I've got 3 examples lined up, but depending on time, I might skip one of those, probably the last one. And then again, if there's time, a lot of my research in particular has to do with SNAP, the food stamp program. And so I'll talk a little bit about my own work and how the ideas of behavioral economics have been applied to improving designs for the food stamp program, if we've got time for that. So zooming way out to the macro perspective of what behavioral economics is, It's a thread of economic theory that was started in earnest after psychologists made real inroads into the profession in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Most famously, and I'll talk about this guy at the end, a psychologist named Danny Kahneman began publishing research in economic journals in the late 1970s, pointing out really big problems with the way economists thought about risk. And while he was initially sort of written off as a bit of a crackpot outsider, he really connected with a lot of people inside the field, or I shouldn't say a lot of people, but a real core of people that pushed his research agenda forward over the next 30 years. And one of the most important people that he really influenced at that very early stage of his career was Richard Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics last year. And this quote here sums up the outsiders' view that they were taking on of what's going on and what's going wrong with the economics profession as we see it in the early 1980s. And what he said was that the purely economic man is indeed close to being a social moron. Economic theory has been much preoccupied with this rational fool. And what he's taking issue with is the idea that when we make economic policy recommendations, those policies are predicated on how we think people are going to react to those policies when we roll them out. And economists have for a long time, and most economists still rely on very sparse models of human behavior, very simplistic models of human behavior. The idea was that if you're talking about an economic policy that's going to get rolled out and affect thousands or millions of people, you're not really losing much by specifying human behavior in a very sparse way. And what Thaler really was taken by when he started getting into these theories from psychology is that, no, I don't think that that's true. I think when you model human behavior more carefully, you're going to learn that a lot of what you're doing with policy might be counterproductive or less productive than it could be because you're not thinking closely enough about the way that real people work. So to set out where Thaler was coming from, this is something you're probably all pretty familiar with, but just to go over it, classical economic theory rests upon two pillars: rationality and self-interest. This is why it's part of the reason why we call this the dismal science, right? We're not being very optimistic about the way people behave. What I mean by rationality I think there are three pillars of what we mean here. The first is that people exhibit no self-control problems. They can perfectly plan and execute any set of actions that they think is best to execute at a given point in time. They don't have to worry about their future self wanting to deviate from the plan that their present self sets for them now. So self-control problem seems like a niche issue, but actually it's a very broad issue. It means that future behavior is not always predictable in the present. People have to exhibit no reference dependence. I'll explain exactly what that means in a little bit. I'm going to punt on that for now. And perhaps most perniciously, classical economic rationality depends on people having what are called rational expectations, meaning that when I don't know something about the future, or there's some uncertain object that I face in my life now, I sort of accurately can estimate or I can at least accurately estimate the distribution of uncertainty from which realizations are going to be drawn. So people are very sophisticated econometric forecasters, and they collect all necessary information and process it accurately. And then self-interest is self-explanatory. We assume that people maximize their own well-being, or at most they maximize, let's say, the well-being of the household they're in for Darwinian reasons. But that's the most generous we're going to allow ourselves to be with human behavior. So let's think about how a classical model of theory might be applied to economic policy. Let's think about the decision that an individual faces whether or not to engage in an auto theft opportunity. So we've got a benefit and a cost of the decision to engage in auto theft. I'm going to call the benefit 1 minus PC times VA. And here's what those parameters mean. PC is the probability that I get caught, and VA is going to be the value of the auto that's being targeted. So the benefit is the probability I don't get caught times the value of the car that I successfully steal. The cost is PC, that's the probability of getting caught, times the punishment cost that I face when I get caught. So this is a simple model of the benefits that people weigh against the costs when considering whether to engage in auto theft. And so the policymaker looks at this and says, aha, there are 3 parameters in this model. And so there are 3 ways that I can try and reduce the amount of auto theft that occurs. I could increase policing. That'll increase the value of PC, making the benefits smaller and the cost larger. I could make stolen vehicles less valuable by shrinking VA. That seems like a difficult approach. Or I could impose stricter sentences. That makes CP larger and increases the costs while leaving the benefits unchanged. So it's a very limited diet, a small menu of choices that I'm left with. If this is the very stark model of decision making that I think people are engaging in when deciding to commit this crime. The behavioral economist looks at this and says, you're relying on some really outlandish assumptions here when you link this model to how we should make economic policy. Do people really perceive the changes that the policymaker enacts to PC and CP accurately? When you increase policing, what sort of knowledge and awareness do you think the individual making the decision has of that on the precise values on the benefit and cost side of this equation? When you increase the punishments that I might encounter years down the road, do you really think that that information is observed and accurately processed by the individual making this decision? And zooming out even further, is this type of rational trade-off between costs and benefits really how we think the decision to steal a vehicle or not is being made? Is this the right framework? And so, behavioral economists that have studied crime have taken this up and said, look, we think there's a big problem, there's a big disconnect between us making a punishment more severe and people learning that punishments have been made more severe and that having a deterrent effect on behavior. There's a group of economists working with the New York justice system that have shown really promising effects of just sending notifications to people, reminding them of the punishments for missed court dates after they're out on bail. And they've had a dramatic increase in the frequency with which people have appeared at their court hearings just by reminding them a week beforehand, by the way, you may not know, but here are the consequences associated with that. So the rational model just sort of assumes that individuals are going to take into account all this information and make a rational trade-off, whereas the behavioral economist sort of thinks about more meta issues like, is this information being transmitted? Maybe we need to nudge people with that information to actually get this model to do its job. So going from this example to a summary of what I really think behavioral economics does is that we take a more expansive view of economic theory that's informed by psychology. And the goal of that is not just because we want to do a better job of modeling human behavior. That's sort of the psychologist's job. We're interested in this from a practical point of view. We're looking at this more expansive model of human behavior because we want to see if there are new avenues to apply for policy that might be cheaper or might be more effective for achieving the desired outcomes. So what are the differences, sort of the more substantive differences between how a classical economic theorist and a behavioral economist thinks about human behavior? I want to briefly describe that by showing you what I call the 4-part foundation of human behavior. Again, this is a big simplification, but I can roughly, as economists, we can roughly break down the behavior, the key behavior of an individual making important economic decisions into 4 quadrants. In other words, if we want to distinguish individual A from individual B, there are 4 areas where we would really want to know how those individuals were different to see if they made different decisions. That's time preference, so that's about trade-offs between the present and the future. Risk preference, making decisions when the outcomes are uncertain. Social preference, that's when I'm making decisions where the consequences affect the well-being of others. And belief formation, that's sort of the odd one out. That's not really about my preferences, it's more about how I respond to information and use that new information to create new beliefs about the world going forward. The way that a classical economist would fill in these boxes is they would do so as sparsely as possible. And that's not because they're lazy, it's because they're trying to create a really general model. They don't like extra parameters, they want to make things as simple as they can. And so my time preference is described by a single parameter that describes my patience. My risk preference is described by a single parameter that says this is how risk averse I am. I don't have any social preferences because only my own well-being enters my maximization behavior. And my beliefs are formed accurately. I take all information and I process them sort of the the math jumbo here, mumbo jumbo here is that I would process them as if I'm a Bayesian. So all information is aggregated into beliefs using Bayes' rule, which is sort of just to say that they're basically correct expectations. The behavioral economist takes a scientific method approach to what should be in those boxes. So I've put up a lot of stuff here that I'll go over briefly, but what I'm really trying to emphasize is that what really belongs in this time preference box or this risk preference box to inform how people make decisions between today and tomorrow or with uncertain outcomes should be determined by the data. I should ask a question like, can I measure someone's health self-control? And does that self-control predict how they make time preference decisions? If the answer is yes, then self-control belongs in this box. So very informed by psychology, the behavioral economist says, I don't know what should go in that box. I'm going to ask questions of the data using laboratory experiments and things like that to figure out what should be in there. And lo and behold, there are all these other dimensions of decision making that we haven't considered nearly enough that are huge factors in determining how people behave. So within time preference, for example, one of the most important things behavioral economists focus on is self-control. The degree to which when I make a plan for my future self today, my future self actually executes that plan. This turns out to both be different than somebody's general patience and to be incredibly important for the decisions they make. Risk preference turns out to have much more than one dimension. We'll talk about reference dependencies specifically later on. Social preference turns out to be a huge and robust area of individual behavior. People care about the well-being of others. That's altruism. Surprisingly, though, people care more about being believed to be someone who cares about the well-being of others. We call that warm glow giving, and that turns out to be an immense motivator of behavior as well. Within belief formation, again, rather than accurate belief formation, we've got dozens of models now of the errors and fallacies that people commit when trying to update their beliefs. And we'll talk a little bit about the good news, bad news effect later on. So I'm not sort of trying, I don't want to describe all these items here, but this is just to say what we're looking for is to build up a rich set of descriptors of human behavior and inform that not by theory or philosophy, but through data. So what do I actually do with this stuff? It sort of sounds like I'm a philosopher at this point, but I'm really not. I spend my day doing the same thing that most economists do, regardless of what theories they're interested in or whether, a lot of economists don't care one way or another about theory. I collect and analyze data. I run lab and field experiments. I write papers about economic policy. It's just that I'm focused in particular on diagnosing market and policy failures that come from a failure to properly understand some behavioral aspect of decision making. And if we can identify such failures, that means there might be really low-cost, high-effectiveness solutions out there for those policies. So I've dangled that sort of bait of we're doing this to come up with better policy, and I'll try and give you some examples now from the workplace of how behavioral economists have actually tried to diagnose these types of failures and use them to suggest solutions. Actually, it's a shame. The first one I'm starting out with is one where we're really diagnosing a problem, but the solutions aren't well-founded yet, but I guess it's a place to start. So the first example of putting behavioral economic analysis to use in the workplace has to do with that lower right quadrant of the fourfold pattern of belief of human behavior I showed you earlier, and that's how people form their beliefs about other people in this case. So beliefs about the productivity of my employees, of contractors that I might hire, of competitors, of the managers under me in my organization are critical. I have to make compensation decisions. I have to make project delegation decisions. I have to make HR decisions. How I come to form my beliefs about how productive, how effective an employee or a partner individuals are around me is hugely important. So the way we think about that is that I have some prior belief about how productive you are. You do something and something happens, and then I have to change my belief, and we call that the posterior belief. It turns out that what the actual content of that something happens is really complicated. And the specific structure of that production function that takes us from prior to posterior is worthy of close study. I want you to imagine a situation where that something happens in the middle, in between my prior belief and my posterior belief, is that workers takes some effort. That combines with random chance, and that produces firm profit. The manager here faces a really difficult job that classical economists have not really fully appreciated the difficulty of. Firm profit is observable. The two inputs to that in this very simplified model are usually unobservable. Worker effort is usually unobservable or perhaps only partially observable. Random chance, not very observable. But those two things combine in some ambiguous way to produce firm profit. And the manager faces the incredibly difficult task of only observing firm profit and trying to work backwards to identify worker effort in order to update his or her beliefs on the productivity of that worker that took that effort. Classical economic theory sort of waves their hand at the difficulty of this task because it's a simple application of what I referred to earlier as Bayes' rule. Given some knowledge of the distribution of random chance, I can sort of integrate out random chance and come up with the best possible estimate of worker effort in an unbiased way after observing firm profit. This turns out to be a ludicrous assumption, and a whole lot of literature shows that this is a decision that this is a belief updating situation where people are very inaccurate. And what behavioral theory says is, look, what are people going to do when they face this incredibly cognitively difficult task? Well, rather than calculate their beliefs accurately, we've now got a whole list of things in this bottom right quadrant of biases and heuristics and probability errors that people are going to commit on their way to substituting that very difficult problem for a much easier problem. So when faced with this integration problem, the behavioral economist says the manager looks for an easier adjacent problem to solve. So I want to look at an example of research on this specific topic by a researcher named Heather Sarsons. She studies primary care practitioner physician referrals to surgeons. So as a PCP, I see you and I identify that you need a particular procedure, and I have a menu of surgeons in the area that I can choose to refer you to. Based on my opinion of how good they are, at least conditional on availability, I'm going to refer my business to particular surgeons. She asks the question, how does referral behavior change when a surgeon has a patient die? And what she's looking at here specifically are routine procedures that should not result in the death of a patient, but there's some rate at which there are complications and that occurs. This is a really hard decision-making problem for the primary care practitioner. And so rather than perform that job accurately, they rely on a bias or a stereotype to make that decision. And in this particular case, they rely on gender to help them update their beliefs about the quality of the surgeon at play. That's a strange term. The quality of the surgeon that they referred the patient to. So what you're looking at here on the right is sort of the big important graph from her paper. On the x-axis, you've got the quarter relative to when a PCP had a patient die at a particular surgeon. And then on the y-axis, you're seeing a normalized measure of how likely I am to refer a patient to that surgeon. And you can see prior to the death of a patient occurring in quarter zero, there are no referral differences to male and female surgeons. So it doesn't look like ex ante PCPs are biased against female surgeons. And actually, in another part of the paper, she verifies that deaths during this procedure are no more likely to occur for female surgeons than male surgeons. In fact, they're slightly less likely to occur under female surgeons. So it's sort of important to have that context. The death of the patient occurs during quarter zero, and then there's a big drop in referrals to female surgeons only after the patient death. And what we would say is that this is an example of the good news, bad news effect, and also something else called outcome bias, but I want to focus on this being an example of the good news, bad news effect, which is a model of how people update their beliefs when they face a really difficult problem. And they also have they have strong priors about how they expect their beliefs to move. And that is, actually, the best way to explain the good news, bad news effect is with a fantastic laboratory experiment on the same topic, where researchers conducting a lab experiment got a group of people together in a room and showed them pictures of one another and asked them all to rank everybody in the room on attractiveness from top to bottom. And then they sent people either a random number from 1 to the bottom rank, or they sent them their true average ranking across everybody in the room, and they had them guess, did you get the random signal or did you get the real signal? And what do you think they found? When it said that I was more attractive than I thought I was, that's the real signal. But when it said that I was less attractive than I thought I was, then I thought that was random chance. So people attribute information they receive to either random chance or intentional behavior of others in a way that's guided by their priors. And this is an example of that with gender. If a male surgeon has something go unusually wrong, I'm more likely to attribute that to, oh, they got unlucky, it was a difficult situation. If a female surgeon has something go wrong, I'm more likely to attribute that to a lack of skill on her part. It's worth pointing out that this behavior is identical for both male and female PCPs. So let me talk about another example, as I think I'm about 25 minutes in right now. I think we're doing okay. So I'm going to move to a different quadrant of that fourfold pattern of individual behavior to talk about another application of behavioral economics to the workplace, and that's time preference. And I tried to sell you earlier that behavioral economists take the idea of self-control, separate from just how patient am I, but specifically how reliable is my future self in making good on the plans that I form today. We take that very seriously. And the reason why is because if my future self doesn't do the things that my present self plans for it to do, then that really screws everything up, both for that individual in terms of a return on investment sense. It actually screws up things in the macro economy as well. This is a big problem, even though it kind of seems like a niche issue. On the individual level, if my future self doesn't follow through on the plans I make for it, I'm going to make some really bad investment decisions. I'm going to make behavior contingent investments that don't pay off. My favorite example of this is like the decision to take out $80,000 in student loans. That being a good decision is contingent on me going to school and completing my degree and getting that degree in some field that's going to remunerate me for those losses. I shouldn't say losses, for those costs. Yeah. Ugh. It's a good thing you're not my students hearing me say that. That's contingent on me making good on that investment. And if I don't do that, if my future self doesn't maximize the value of that degree that I sign up for and I finance with loans, it could be a really bad decision in the long run. On the consumption side, self-control is a really big issue for things like budgeting and dieting. I could consume as if this is kind of a tricky sentence. I will consume as if I'm less patient than I believe myself to be. What do I actually mean by that? That's kind of mumbo jumbo. What I mean is that I will take decisions now that look really impatient. And I'll justify that by saying it's okay. In the future, I'll be really good. So I'm going to I believe myself to be a pretty patient, in control kind of guy. And because that's true, I can splurge today a little bit. But if I do that every day, we're going to add up to having some serious problems. So I act more impatiently than I actually expect myself to be. The macroeconomic problem with this is that what this means is that you're going to get interest rates that do not fully reflect the true cost of spending. And that makes borrowing much more attractive than it should be and saving much less attractive than it should be. So let's talk about, I just wanted to give you, in case it wasn't clear what I meant by the future self, present self thing, I wanted to use the gym versus Netflix and chill example as my favorite example. It's easy to make the decision that today, after a long day of work, I drove up here from Eugene, I got to drive back, you guys have to listen to me for all this time. Clearly, Netflix and eat popcorn is the right decision today and not go to the gym after work. But tomorrow is a new day, and my plan is to surely right that error by going to the gym. But when tomorrow actually rolls around, of course, it's another hard day at work, something else I didn't expect comes up, and I again choose Netflix and popcorn. So I'm sort of making consumption choices today that are only justified by a future plan of action that doesn't actually come to fruition. So let's take an example of this now in the workplace. This disconnect between what I want to do in the future and what I might actually do in the future instead creates a really interesting role for a policy called commitment contracts. And my favorite example of commitment contracts in the workplace comes from a paper by Supreet Kaur and others. and it's on worker behavior in an Indian data entry firm. Data entry firm is a really neat place to study this because you can observe productivity really precisely. You know exactly how many lines of data an individual is entering. And what you're looking at over there on the right is a figure that describes the pay scale that these individuals have access to in the experiment that these researchers run. The gray upward sloping line is a standard piece rate pay scale. For every line of data you enter, you're going to earn X dollars, and that just continues linearly with no slope changes or bumps. It's a very simple pay scale. The other pay scale here in the dotted black line is a really weird one because it's what we call dominated. There is no point on the production axis. There's no amount of production I could do on the x-axis that would lead me to get more earnings from the dominated contract than the piece rate contract. In every state of the world, the dominated contract is worse. Or at least I should be careful. In every state of the world, it's worse or the same as the piece rate contract. But their hypothesis is that workers sort of at the beginning of the day or the day before have specific goals. I want to go to work and I want to do all these lines of data and I want to hit my earnings targets. But as I work and as I get tired, it becomes more and more taxing to hit those targets. So if you come to them the day before and ask them, which of these two contracts would you like to give yourself for tomorrow, they hypothesize that there might be a demand for the dominated contract. Because that's a way of my present self changing the incentives of my future self in a way that gives my future self a little kick in the butt. So you better get to X on the production axis, or else you're really going to have wasted that day of work. And if you do get to X, you'll get a big bonus and you'll have achieved your goal. So this disconnect between my present self and future self creates demand, potentially, for this kind of contract that should never have any demand for it in a world of classical economic theory. So they give workers the choice between these two types of contracts, and they find that 36% of workers in their study selected the dominated contract. So these aren't universal solutions. Not everybody faces these problems, or even if, some people may face these problems but not recognize that they do. That's fine. But over a third of individuals seem to anticipate this problem in themselves and have a desire to sort of pre-react to it and constrain their future selves' behavior by messing with their future selves' incentives. The group, they didn't offer these choices to everybody. They did a randomized control trial where some people had access to the contract and others didn't. And they found that the group that they offered this dominated contract to had both increased production and earnings as a result of this contract offer. So here's, I think, a really nice example of both a transparent and simple application of behavioral theory to helping people solve a disconnect between how hard they want to work and how hard they actually work. All right, in the interests of time, let's see, what do I want to skip on? I want to... Yeah, I'll skip ahead. I've given two examples. If we distribute these slides, there's a really neat additional workplace example about incentivizing teachers to work harder by, rather than giving them a bonus for performance, after students take a test, you give them a performance bonus 6 months before students take a test, and then tell them if you don't hit your performance target, we're going to take that bonus away. That's a little harsh, but it is 2.5 to 3.5 more times effective in increasing student test scores. So I'll skip that one. And I do want to give a brief plug for some of my own work on the food stamp program. So if you're not familiar with food stamps, it's a huge safety net program. And a wealth of economic researchers shows that SNAP households are not able to use their food assistance to achieve a steady diet over the course of the month. We call this the calorie crunch, where consumption is much higher at the beginning of the month than the end of the month. And just to give you an idea of how big that is, I'm not going to have time to go through these graphs. I'll just give you the takeaway at the bottom of the screen here, which is that median per day food expenditure falls from $36 to $3 over the course from the beginning of the SNAP month when I get my benefits to the end of the SNAP month when I'm running really low. You might say, well, it's just expenditure. Well, we can actually measure consumption as well. And we find that average meals per day consumption falls by about 0.37. So you're eating a third fewer meals on the last day of the month than you are at the beginning of the month. This is a huge problem for developing kids. Classical theory says that this shouldn't happen, Behavioral theory says this is a natural consequence of the way that real humans' time preference works. What can we do about it? Well, we should provide resources more often, more smoothly. And let's test that. What happens to kids' calorie crunch when school is in session and they get school meals? Some of my recent work shows that it just goes away entirely. School meals mitigate this entirely for kids. What do we do then about kids on summer break and with adults? There are no direct tests yet, but behavioral theory says that we should shift to a more frequent disbursement. I have other work on SNAP that I'll skip for time purposes, and I'll just conclude. I want to emphasize that this is a really tiny snapshot of what behavioral economists do. If you find this interesting, if you want to know more about all of the entries in that fourfold pattern of behavior that I talked about, I highly, highly recommend the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Rather than just sort of skim over those, he really goes into depth in specifically risk, time, belief updating, and social preferences. What do we know as behavioral economists are important determinants of individual behavior? The last thing I'll do is just give you guys a general pitch for thinking about behavioral economics in your own policy work. Behavioral economists love experimental methods more than other economists because we have this deep background in psychology. We're constantly looking for new partners in government and industry to test and develop new policies. You may not know this, there's a ton of research money out there that is specifically earmarked for academic partnerships with state and local government agencies. The kind of research they're looking for is stuff like the Oregon healthcare study. Oregon's that Medicaid experiment made Oregon sort of like a leader in national healthcare research. And if you're curious about ways to use behavioral economics to improve the architecture of policy, and you don't want to pay for it, and you want to get somebody else like JPAL to pay for it, I highly recommend contacting economists at UO. We don't talk with you guys enough, and we should talk with you guys more, and we'd love to do that. Thank you so much, Daniel, for the opportunity to come up here and speak. Yeah.
So, a question. Back when you were talking about the surgeons and sort of how people choose, obviously that's not a behavior we want to incentivize because there's obviously other maybe real reasons why you should select a surgeon other than gender.
Yeah.
How much of that is maybe related to institutions that are in place or some sort of other like cultural factors that we may want to focus on to, I guess, change behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would have, before reading the paper, I would have thought that a lot of it was due to cultural or institutional, well, it might be due to institutional factors. But then, the finding that female primary care physicians exhibit identical behavior pushes me more towards believing this is about the cultural perception of who a doctor is. Right? There's this perception that a doctor is a man, probably a white man, and so I prefaced that example by saying, here's a situation where behavioral economics says you're going to have big problems here, but we don't have good concepts for the solution yet. So I've done work not on gender bias in the good news, bad news effect arena, but just in general, how do you get this good news, bad news effect to go away? And we've tried things like outsourcing the decision to independent third parties. We've tried things like giving, in this example, it would be the equivalent of the primary care physician not having access to information about the random shocks and only having information about verified performance, and we can't make it go away. So I wish I knew more about what to do about this, other than think of ways to develop gender-blind review. But that's often infeasible. I mean, you know who the surgeons are in your area. Yeah. So I don't have a lot of optimistic policy recommendations to make based on that particular example.
Similar studies maybe been conducted in, and this might be a tough example because maybe that's more universally the case, sort of that vision or view of who a doctor is in a male-dominated society, but maybe in other areas of the world where maybe that perception is different, see if results have changed.
That's a great question. This is I don't have an example. I mean, this is like hot off the presses. This research is, I think, accepted but not even published yet. So the answer is definitely no. We don't know what this looks like in other cultures or in other areas. One would sort of love, there's some older work on gender biases in performance that looks at differences between competitiveness between men and women, and they do experiments both in patrilineal tribal societies and matrilineal tribal societies. This is work just generally on, like, if you're competing against somebody in a tournament, would you rather your opponent be male or female? Very abstract stuff, but they find that in the matrilineal societies, that difference in culture absolutely changes people's preference to compete against women, and instead gives them a preference to compete against men. Yeah. Yep.
So you've got a lot of people here who work with DHS and who work specifically with SNAP data. Out of curiosity, what are some future studies you guys are looking at, or even like a wish list of things you guys would like to start looking at?
So right now, the SNAP project that I'm most heavily involved in has to do with figuring out how to deliver healthy food subsidies to individuals. So that paper I referenced there with the school meals, I also document there's this plummeting in nutritional quality that also happens over the course of the month as you substitute healthy, expensive foods for unhealthy, cheap foods. So we're doing work now with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We're sort of pioneering these subsidies that the USDA has played with, but we're giving people what we call subsidy menus, where they have a list of multiple different types of subsidies that they can choose from. We find this generates a ton of buy-in into the subsidy. So I can give somebody a subsidy and say, here's 30% discount on fruits and vegetables. They're like, okay, that helps a little bit. If we give them a couple different subsidy options, if you select into that fruit and vegetable subsidy, you use it to a much larger degree than you would have used it had we forced you into it. And in fact, even though a very small fraction of the sample selects these very unhealthy subsidies that we offer, but despite that, average healthy food purchasing goes way up with the subsidy choice. So this has been a new project for me that's been a lot of fun, thinking about just how to design a subsidy program to maximize its effectiveness. I've got a paper that looks at the switch from paper food stamps to EBT. And my hypothesis there is that shifted that in a sense that shifted SNAP funds from community property to mom's property. And what I can document is that when that shift happens, you get actually a mitigation of the calorie crunch, households do a better job saving, and food purchases get healthier. And this is sort of an idea that you might have. Let me just flip to the slide real quick. So rather than thinking about everybody as being behavioral, some people are more behavioral than others. Imagine a household with one rational individual that we'll call mom, just for sake of this example, and then multiple irrational individuals that we'll call dad and kids. Empowering mom, and not just I do this work with EBT, but people have looked at this in other policies. Empowering mom is like always a good idea. And you get, other people have shown that you get better goods purchased, especially from a kid's point of view. You get like more baby food purchased and stuff like that when you empower mom. This is the first paper to show that you actually change the timing of purchases in a way that mitigates the calorie crunch. So I'm very interested in subsidy delivery. I'm very interested in how benefits are delivered to households, both for SNAP and for things like EITC, thinking about jointly held bank accounts versus individually held bank accounts. So these two, the EBT and the subsidies, which I don't have up here, are sort of my work in progress, whereas the school stuff is sort of already off and published, and I've moved on to other stuff.
Sorry, that's a follow-up question. The difference between paper coupons versus the debit card. One of the things that I think about, though, is do you see any effects like you do similar to like when you try to budget with cash as opposed to budgeting with plastic, where it's easier to see the cash physically going down in value as opposed to not so much being
So when I went into this paper, I was sort of like holding these two things up as countervailing hypotheses. And one was that the cash is more tangible, and that the EBT was less tangible. So I was actually quite surprised to see what I think is a property rights effect so strongly dominate the other effect. If you look at, this is I didn't get a chance to describe this graph. This is sort of a graph of the calorie crunch in bar chart form. You've got your shopping trip expenditure on the vertical axis, and then week of the benefit month on the horizontal axis. If you look at what's going on the left for single adult households, you get basically nothing. And I was surprised to see that, so I don't really see evidence of that cash versus plastic effect. Although you could imagine that these individuals are perhaps more aware of their balances than typical individuals that are spending with cash or credit. So maybe it's not the right population for that particular study. Yep.
You talked about how bad we are at, how bad our future self is at following through on the plans that our present self makes. But it feels like I'm really good at that. It feels like I think everybody feels like they're really good at that.
Yeah.
And it looks like my friends are really good at that. So, well, why are we so mistaken about that aspect of our performance?
That's a really good question. If you dive into the behavioral theory on this, we define two different types of individuals with self-control problems, the sophisticates and the naifs. The sophisticates are the individuals who recognize this in themselves, and they seek out these commitment contracts like the folks in the Cower, Kramer, and Mullинathan paper here. The 36% of individuals, they recognize this problem and seek to mitigate it. What's going on with the rest of the people is not that they're all perfectly in control individuals. They're about evenly split between individuals who are good at following through on their plans and for people who aren't but don't realize it. So the answer to your question, a lot of people are exactly like that, where they have these problems but they do not perceive them, and it's much harder to intervene and help those individuals because they're not going to demand commitment contracts. You're going to have to be more paternalistic in changing their choice set if you want to affect the choices that they make. As to why people don't learn from these, I think what you're suggesting is why don't people learn? I think there's a lot of ego. There's a lot of, if we think about what goes into this updating process between prior belief something happens and posterior belief, there's a lot of ego utility that comes into play here, sort of like self-preservation of my self-image plays a really big role. If let's take another example. If my beliefs as a climate change denier are challenged, there's a lot of self-preservation and ego utility that prevents me from properly updating my beliefs in favor of believing in climate change. So I think it's very hard to learn about myself when there's self-image in the way of that learning process. I want to be really respectful of Megan's time, though, because I think I might be pushing it. No? Maybe any other questions? All right. Thank you guys very much.
And for now, just for people that have been sitting here for a little while, we're going to do like a 10-minute break. So feel free, get up, wander. There is a cafe located in the basement. If you guys want some refreshments, we have some refreshments in the back table as well for you.